General Winchester, a man out of his depth. Colonel Proctor, a stickler for the rules. The volatile Major Forsyth. Today, we delve into the men whose decisions and rivalries fueled the chaos along the frozen borders, leaving a trail of heroism and bloodshed. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends, Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit Series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. In the opening months of the War of 1812, the United States continued to look woefully underprepared for a war they wanted to fight. Detroit was surrendered without a shot being fired in its defense. Squabbles between generals, politicians, and career soldiers resulted in disorganization, which was a key to the defeat of the Americans at Queenston Heights. While the Americans had lost the battle, though, at Queenston Heights, they gained an advantage. Sir Isaac Brock was killed during the battle. Brock had been hailed as the hero of Upper Canada before that battle even started, having devised a plan which resulted in the capture of Detroit with just 2 men being wounded. It wouldn't just be the British and Canadians who would mourn the death of Brock. With his passing also came a lessened possibility of the British pushing for an independent homeland for the Indigenous allies during the war. While the British and Americans were fighting in the Niagara region, back towards Detroit, there were also clashes between the opposing forces. When Hull surrendered Detroit, he was dismissed from the army after being court-martialed for cowardice and originally sentenced to death. The command of the American forces in the area was passed over to James Winchester. His plans for the army, however, proved to not be as ambitious as most wanted, as they didn't include making a major push to retake Detroit. Detroit served as a key asset for the British. It gave them a foothold on American soil in the early goings of the war. It was also a source of pride for the Americans to want to take it back. Now, the Americans had declared war and to this point had suffered nothing but defeat. The only territory lost by either side was theirs. Since Winchester wasn't ready to push for Detroit, he would be replaced, with William Henry Harrison coming into the role as the general in charge of the Army of the Northwest, and Winchester would be made second in command. Harrison would go on from the war to serving as the 9th President of the United States. His tenure, just 31 days, the shortest of any president in American history. He passed away in office, and his death would actually create a constitutional crisis, as the presidential succession wasn't completely defined in the U.S. Constitution. This all happened 28 years after the events that we're talking about today. Now back to the matter at hand. Harrison was in charge of the U.S. Army in the Northwest. Commanding the British forces at Detroit was Colonel Henry Proctor, and commanding a sizable force of Indigenous warriors allied with the British was Tecumseh. Proctor had helped defend Fort Malden at the outset of the war near Amherstburg, and was placed in command by Brock when the hero of Upper Canada had gone to the Niagara region. He was known for being by the book. His men were always noted as being very sharp and having good drill and discipline. This, however, lends credence to the phrase, "no inspection-ready unit has passed combat." After the Siege of Detroit, the first time the British and Americans would come into direct contact on the Northwestern Front, aside from skirmishes between patrols, would be near Frenchtown in January of 1813. This battle, which was more of a series of battles fought over the course of 5 days, would be the bloodiest ever fought in Michigan. The number of men killed would be the highest number suffered by the Americans in a single battle during the entire war. So how did it come to happen? Harrison was set on retaking Detroit. To do so, he would be marching his men north, divided into 2 columns. He would lead one of those columns himself, and the other was under his second-in-command, Winchester. Winchester had roughly 1,000 men underneath him, mostly inexperienced men from Kentucky. He had been ordered to remain close to the column under Harrison's command. In a theme that was so common in the early going of the war, though, the subordinate general thought the order was more of a suggestion. Winchester completely ignored Harrison and sent a small detachment north to Frenchtown along the River Raisin. This column was under the command of Colonel William Lewis. They headed up the Maumee River from Winchester's camp towards Frenchtown. Under Lewis's command was 570 Kentucky volunteers, and they were joined by another 110 men from the Kentucky under Lieutenant Colonel John Allen. The Americans were receiving varied intelligence about what the situation was in Frenchtown. One of the reports stated that Canadian militiamen, the Essex, along with Indigenous allies, had left, falling back 18 miles to Brownstown. There was another report that the Canadians were being reinforced by the British from Amherstburg and Port Malden. With both of these reports being a possibility, Lewis thought the best course of action would be to do something now. They broke camp and used the frozen coastal waters of Lake Erie to speed their travel to Frenchtown. There were 50 men of the Essex militia. Their commander was Major Ebenezer Reynolds. Reynolds was familiar with the area. He had been born in Detroit, and his family moved to Amherstburg when Michigan was formally handed over to the Americans in 1794. He joined the militia and became an officer. The morning of January 18, 1813, he would be ready to engage the Americans. In addition to the men, he also had a single 3-pounder cannon, which was manned by militia volunteers who were under the tutelage of a British soldier, a bombardier Kitson. The Canadians also had around 150 Potawatomi warriors with them. Word came that the Americans were advancing from the south, so Reynolds got to work putting his men into position. They would take cover behind houses and fences. The Indigenous warriors did the same. Kitson positioned the artillery piece with a clear view of the river. The Canadians were outnumbered 4-1. This didn't deter their efforts, though. Colonel Lewis and the men from Kentucky appeared around 3 in the afternoon. The 3 regiments formed up under fire from the cannon, but it would have little effect as the Americans crossed the river. The crossing itself, though, would have been a comical sight if not for the circumstances. The Americans kept slipping and sliding on the ice of the river, and it got to the point where Lewis ordered his men to ditch their backpacks so they could maintain their balance on the slippery surface. Once they reached the solid footing off the ice, they moved into the village of Frenchtown with Reynolds and the Canadians falling back across open fields to forest to the north. This move would provide a change in course for the rest of the engagement. The Americans tried to move to flank the Canadians, but the Indigenous troops would keep up a brisk and effective cover fire. The Canadians and Indigenous were employing a run-and-gun strategy, falling back a slight bit, and then opening fire on the Americans. Captain John McCalla was one of the Kentuckians in the ranks during that advance. He described the scene. "My fellow soldiers extended lifeless, bloody corpses on the ground, and many others crying in agony with dangerous wounds. I have heard balls whistling as thick as the pattering hail around me, and yet not touched even in my clothes. I wondered that I should escape and expected every ball would be for me." William Atherton, a Kentucky rifleman, described the strategy of the Canadians from his point of view. "Their method was to retreat rapidly until they were out of sight. which was soon the case in the brushy woods. And while we were advancing, they were preparing to give us another fire, so we were generally under the necessity of firing upon them as they were retreating. The running battle would cover roughly 2 miles throughout the woods to the north of the village. The setting sun would bring it to an end, around 3 hours after it had started. The Americans would see 12 men killed and 55 wounded. As for the Canadians, the Americans thought that they suffered an insurmountable number of casualties, but no bodies were found. And the rolls of the Essex militia don't show any casualties, whether wounded or killed in action, from that day. The Canadians fell back through the night to the village of Brownstown. A scout was then dispatched to Amherstburg to warn Colonel Proctor that the Americans had captured Frenchtown and were continuing their advance. The British soldiers were attending a ball celebrating the birthday of Queen Victoria in Amherstburg when word came by an officer who came bursting in, and it's reported the officer said, "My boys, you must prepare to dance to a different tune. The enemy is upon us, and we are going to surprise them." The plan was Proctor would rally his men, cross the ice to rendezvous with Reynolds, and take the fight back to Frenchtown. For the Americans, Brigadier General Winchester would catch up with Lewis and the Kentuckians on January 20th. Now remember, this advance had been carried out by Winchester and Lewis without orders from General William Harrison, the commanding officer of the American forces in the region. However, Harrison was happy that the attack had succeeded. To hold the town, more men were ordered to Frenchtown to help secure the village, and Winchester was ordered to hold the ground. Now, for many of the Americans, the battle on the 18th was the first time they had seen combat. They were still very green, and Winchester himself was rather ineffective in planning against a counterattack. He didn't have enough supplies. The American regulars were outside of the palisades that had been put up around the town, and no sentries or pickets were in place, and warnings that the British were coming were brushed aside, with Winchester reportedly telling the people of Frenchtown it would be some time before the British got there, giving them plenty of time to finish the defenses. Time, though, was something that they didn't have. Proctor crossed the Detroit River with 597 regulars of the British Army, the 41st Regiment of Foot, and the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles. This force was joined by around 800 Indigenous warriors and the men of the Essex militia. The Indigenous warriors were under the command of Wyandot chiefs Roundhead and Walk in the Water, and were made up of men from the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Chippewa, Delaware, Miami, Winnebago, Cree, Sauk, and Fox nations. The British also had 6 cannon, manned by the Canadian Provincial Marine. Just before sunrise on January 22nd, the attack to retake Frenchtown began. One of the men of the 41st Regiment of Foot, John Richardson, wrote, "On the 22nd, before daybreak, came within sight of the enemy. Such was their security and negligence that our line was half formed within musket shot of their defenses before they were even aware of our presence." Born in Canada, Richardson volunteered to join the British Army. He would serve in the War of 1812 and was taken prisoner in 1813. After the war, he would go on to serve in a number of infantry regiments and was posted in England and the West Indies. After his soldiering career, Richardson would go on to become an internationally recognized author. He is known for the books Wakausta and The Canadian Brothers, and has been identified as the anonymous author of a number of works published in Europe. He is considered to be the first Canadian author, but his life isn't well celebrated. He would die in 1852 in New York City, where his literary career had failed. He was buried in a pauper's grave. His gravesite is unknown. Back to the battle. The British, Indigenous, and Canadians opened fire on the Americans. The cannon was used to effect, and the heavy volley of the muskets would break the American lines after just 20 minutes. General Winchester was woken from his slumber by the sound of the artillery fire, and he rushed to the scene. He ordered 240 men from the 1st Kentucky Rifle Regiment to support the American Army regulars, who had turned tail and were running. The reinforcement, though, was in vain. The Americans found themselves surrounded on 3 sides. They broke into a full-out retreat, running back towards Ohio. Over 200 were killed during the retreat, on top of the number of men killed during the initial firefight. There were 147 captured. There is a legend surrounding this battle that Winchester had been captured in his pajamas. This, however, is just a legend. He was captured in uniform by Chief Roundhead. He would be stripped of his uniform before being turned over to the British. In the village itself, the Americans tried to hold out. Marksmen from the American side had succeeded in shooting down the artillery crews, but were starting to run out of ammunition. Proctor demanded that Winchester issue an order to his men to stand down, otherwise the remaining men would be killed and the village burned to the ground. Winchester attempted to make counter-proposals, but those were all rebuffed. After all, he was already a prisoner of the British. Winchester issued the order, but the men in the village refused. The fighting would continue for 3 more hours before the last officer in the village, a Major George Madison, formally surrendered. Angered that the fighting had continued for as long as it had, Proctor tried to get the Indigenous to burn Frenchtown anyway. The Potawatomi stopped this, however. The land had been given to the settlers by the Potawatomi, and they did not want to harm the people of the village who had no part in the quarrel. Nearly 300 Americans lost their lives in the fighting, and another 500 were taken prisoner. With the fear that Harrison might send another force to Frenchtown, Proctor decided to fall back to Fort Malden in Upper Canada. Any prisoners who could walk went with the British, while the injured were left behind in Frenchtown. What happened next would come to be known as the Raisin River Massacre. The severely injured who were left behind were killed by the Indigenous who remained. The prisoners who were escorted by the Potawatomi who couldn't keep up on the march to Detroit were killed. The survivor wrote that the road was strewn with mangled bodies for miles. It is estimated that upwards of 100 Americans were killed. After the battle, the Americans would halt their plans to retake Detroit until later in the year, and the concerns about a counterattack didn't really come to fruition right away. The British would hold Frenchtown until September. While all this was happening, there were events happening back along the St. Lawrence River to the east. The Americans in the St. Lawrence area were without supply. To help solve the issue, Major Benjamin Forsyth led a raid on Gananoque, a convoy staging point for the British between Montreal and Kingston. The raid was successful, bringing the Americans some much-needed supplies. After the successful raid, Forsyth transferred from Sackett's Harbor, which is on Lake Ontario across from Kingston, well, sort of, to Ogdensburg, further downstream on the St. Lawrence. That site would see a small British detachment cross over from Prescott, and a few prisoners would be captured, and this set up the Americans to retaliate. On the night of February 6th, Forsyth led around 200 men across the frozen St. Lawrence by sled. They went to Elizabethtown, which is now known as Brockville. The Americans reached the town around 1 a.m. on the 7th, and the town was taken by surprise. Pickets were set up around the town, and the force occupied the town square. 1 man from each side was wounded during the fracas, and 52 British soldiers were taken prisoner. American prisoners were freed, and the barracks were cleared out of supplies, and then the barracks themselves were torched, and Forsyth led his men back to Ogdensburg. Now, this latest raid really rustled Lieutenant Colonel George MacDonnell. He wanted to do something about Forsyth, who had been making it his mission to harass the British. He was, in his own words, bent upon chastising the personal insolence he had received from the American commander. The two would speak face-to-face after the raid on Elizabethtown. MacDonnell crossed the St. Lawrence under a flag of truce to speak with Forsyth and complained about the unmilitary-like and predatory raids the American officer was leading on Canadian towns. This was met with insults, and nothing was resolved. So yes, this was personal. So who was MacDonnell? He was born in Newfoundland and Labrador in 1780 and moved with his family to England in 1796 when his father, the commandant of Fort Townsend, was transferred back. MacDonnell was commissioned that same year as an ensign in the 55th Foot, then became a captain in the 8th King's Regiment of Foot in 1805. The regiment was posted to Nova Scotia in 1808 and then Quebec. Just before the war started, MacDonnell was promoted by George Prevost, the Governor-General of Canada, to Major, and put in charge of the Glengarry Light Infantry, He was then promoted to lieutenant colonel after the Elizabethtown raid and put in command of the garrison at Prescott, opposite of Ogdensburg. Small note about what happened after the war. MacDonnell was one of the first to recommend the use of the Rideau River as an alternate supply line in case the Americans ever decided to shut off access to the St. Lawrence in the event of another conflict. He became rather embittered when he was told by the colonial officer that there was already a plan in the works to use the river, and was upset about the lack of recognition for his efforts during the war. Now back to Prescott in February of 1813. On February 21st, Prevost paid a visit to Prescott, and during the visit, MacDonnell asked for permission to launch an attack across the river to Ogdensburg. Prevost reminded MacDonnell they were to hold defensive positions and not go on the attack unless the British significantly held the advantage. But MacDonnell would continue to drill his men on the ice of the St. Lawrence in full view of the Americans to show that they were ready to attack if they were so inclined. Now, the ranks of the forces stationed at Prescott were temporarily bolstered by reinforcements that were moving through town. This allowed MacDonnell to improvise, since he did now, technically, hold an advantage over the forces Forsyth had in Ogdensburg. The plan drawn up by MacDonnell would see a company of the Glengarry Light Infantry, another 70 militia, and some light cannon on sleighs make a frontal assault on the fort where the Americans were stationed. While this happened, another column, consisting of men from the 8th King's Regiment of Foot, the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles, and 230 militiamen, would cross the river to attack from the flank. On the morning of the 22nd, the British went out to perform their maneuvers on the frozen St. Lawrence as they did most days. The Americans paid no mind, as this was a regular sight. They were taken by surprise, though, when the British suddenly charged across the frozen river to attack the fort. The cannon the British had got stuck in snowdrifts. That allowed the Americans to hold on for a slight time. They weren't prepared, though, for the other column coming in on the flank. MacDonnell would recount the assault in a letter to Prevost after the engagement. Being determined to carry everything with the bayonet, I pushed on my advance, which was gallantly led on by Staff Adjutant Ridge and nobly supported by Captain Eustace and the detachment of the Kings, and well followed up by the militia. The advance took the guns in front, and the Kings rushed up a parallel street to flank them, and driving the enemy's infantry, carried the guns. One of them was turned upon them, giving them in a charge of a division of the militia. The column pursued the enemy through the main street, leading to the bridge over the Black River, under a galling fire from the windows and from the guns in the old fort when it had gained the high back of this river. The battle lasted for roughly half an hour, and the Americans fled to the woods, heading to Sackett's Harbor. The British had taken the day. MacDonnell continued in his after-action report. If Captain Skinner and the Indians had not been detached in the morning as an escort to His Excellency, I would have employed him in intercepting the enemy on his retreat, and would unquestionably have captured the whole garrison, which retreated that day 14 miles, leaving officers and 70 men prisoners. The enemy's force consisted of about 500 men, including militia. The gallantry displayed by all ranks under my command was highly gratifying. The British took the artillery and military stores, burned the boats and schooners frozen into the ice, and left town. Getting back to Sackett's Harbor, Forsyth was determined to get back Ogdensburg. He requested troops from the commanding officers there, but his request was declined. In fact, the blame for the attack on Ogdensburg and its subsequent loss was placed squarely at the feet of Forsyth, with many noting his antics had antagonized the British to the point they acted. The civil authorities in Ogdensburg were also against having the Americans return to the town. This town had a sizable Federalist population who was against the war to begin with. They promptly returned to engaging in trade with the British on the other side of the river for the remainder of the war. The British casualty lists reported 6 dead, 44 wounded, with 4 of those killed being Canadian militia. MacDonnell reported there were 70 Americans taken prisoner. However, the American rolls said there were 26 killed and wounded and around 60 captured. The Battle of Ogdensburg would also play a role in changing American planning for the coming months. The Americans devised a plan to gather 7,000 men at Sackett's Harbor and then cross to Kingston, which was the main base of the British forces on Lake Ontario. With the movement of troops through Prescott, which made the attack on Ogdensburg possible, the American commanders in the area, Commodore Isaac Chauncey and General Henry Dearborn were under the impression the British were about to attack Sackett's Harbor. This prompted a change to the strategy. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we will look at the moves taken after the spring thaw in 1813 by the Americans, which included an attempt to capture the capital of Upper Canada. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoy the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.